Good morning. I'm sorry for the slightly different way that I'm presenting this content. Live streaming is just a little bit too difficult for this computer to handle. So I think I'll get a higher quality product by recording it and then posting it onto YouTube. So I hope you all understand. There's a couple of technical things that we got to talk about first before we do the chapter. This is chapter 18, Renewing the Sectional Struggle. It takes place after the Mexican American War and talks about popular sovereignty and those slavery issues that popped up as a result of the Mexican American War. This is the last chapter of the tested material for your next test. Your next test is on, it's actually going to be next week. I'm going to open it up on Sunday, and it's going to be open until April 25th, which is the Saturday after next. So make sure that you are prepared. Your test review are all of the essential questions that I've given you since we've come back from spring break. You need to write 4 to 6 sentences explaining your answer. It's all open-ended. It's depending on what you write down. It's not multiple choice. Obviously, junior college students, dual credit students, you're going to need to have to take the test on Blackboard because I can make it more secure there for the junior college's purposes. Everybody else's will be on Google Classroom. You have assignments that are due. They are on Google Classroom. Make sure you're doing those. I'm going to have to call home on some people who haven't been doing them. But other than that, let's get to the lesson. Now, we're covering 2 chapters this week, so this video is going to be a little bit longer than previous ones. I'm shooting for just over an hour, and I'll put links in the description for the different sections that you can skip to. After that, later on in the week, we'll be covering chapter 19, which isn't going to be on this test, but it's the lead up to the Civil War. So 2 chapters this week, 2 chapters next week to get caught back up from the break. Okay, let me switch over to my other screen. Okay. And let me make this presentation mode. Okay, chapter 18, Renewing the Sectional Struggle. This is found on page 282 of your book. We have learning objectives here, 5 of them. I'm not going to talk about them because these are the very same questions that you have for your weekly discussions or for your assignment. Here is a chronology of events, which I've included in this slideshow. It's also at the beginning of your chapter. Now, popular sovereignty panacea. One of the things we talked about in the last chapter was how Polk ran as a one-term president. He did not seek a second term. He was a man of his word in that respect. He could have very easily won a second term given the success of this Mexican-American War, but he chose not to. Instead, the DNC, the Democratic National Convention, turned to General Lewis Cass as being their candidate, and they stayed silent on the issue of slavery in the territories. However, one issue that Cass was well known for, and therefore the Democrats became well known for, was the idea of popular sovereignty. That the people of a territory, under the principles of the original Constitution, should themselves determine the status of slavery. Therefore, if popular sovereignty won, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 would be null and void because, say, for example, Kansas and Nebraska, which are above the Missouri Compromise line could decide for themselves if they wanted to be slave states or not. Popular sovereignty did have appeal. It had the democratic tradition of self-determination, that the people themselves make the laws for themselves. It was a compromise, and it tossed the slavery problem to the people of the territories instead of a national decision. People who believed in popular sovereignty hoped that it would dissolve the issue into a series of local issues instead of being a national issue of slave states versus free states, or issue in the Senate, leading to compromise after compromise after compromise, that if each territory decided for themselves whether or not it would be a slave state or a free state, the issue would be resolved. But there was still the possibility that slavery could spread, which the North did not want. The Whigs, on the other hand, nominated General Zachary Taylor, the hero of the Battle of Buena Vista and a Mexican war hero. He was nicknamed Old Rough and Ready by his troops in Mexico. He had never before held a civil office or even voted for president. He was just about as apolitical as you could get. Because of this, he didn't have very much political background, and so the Whigs dodged all troublesome issues and just talked about the qualities of their candidate rather than how he would stand on the issues. Another party popped up in this election called the Free Soil Party. These Free Soilers promoted the Wilmot Proviso that was talked about at the end of chapter 17, and also nominated former President Martin Van Buren as their candidate. Their campaign slogan for the Free Soilers was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men, and they believed that only with free soil in the West could upward mobility continue to flourish. The Free Soil Party was the first party organized around the issue of slavery, but nonetheless, Taylor won on his wartime popularity and defeated the two other candidates. Here's a poster from the election with General Taylor riding on his characteristic. He's got his military uniform on, but also kind of a civilian frock coat over that, and his old straw hat. He doesn't look very military-like, and to be honest, he didn't look very military-like when he was general of the army either. And that was one of the humble things that people liked about him, that soldiers liked about him in the Mexican War. So part of the problem with Taylor being president for the Whigs is that he's actually, even though he doesn't have a political party and he's never really been political, he sides very heavily with the Southern Democrats. He's a Southerner. He owned slaves. And now he's in the White House. The South had a majority in Taylor's cabinet and on the Supreme Court. The South was equal in the Senate. Cotton was growing. Cotton prices were high. And in 1850, few people believed that slavery was threatened where it already existed, like in Louisiana or Virginia. Any place in the Old South, they thought slavery was going to exist forever. However, the South did worry about a tip in the political balance. In 1850, there were 15 slave states and 15 free states. We've talked over and over and over again about how that balance, that precarious balance, ever since the Missouri Compromise, hinged on there being equal representation in the Senate, because the North was getting bigger and bigger and bigger in the House of Representatives. The Senate was the last political holdoff of the South. The California Gold Rush in 1849 drew tens of thousands of, quote, 49ers to the territory, making California become eligible for admission as a state relatively quickly. They got the number of population that was needed. Now, if California was admitted as a free state, that would destroy the balance in the Senate. And so agitation in the territories of New Mexico and Utah for admission as non-slave states as well would have further tipped the balance against the South. Here's an advertisement for ship passage in 1849 to go to California. This advertisement claims 35 days to the gold regions by going south by steamship and either crossing underneath South America or landing in Nicaragua or Panama and going by horse across the isthmus and then getting on another ship on the other side and going to California. But more often than not, most settlers to California took the long way by wagon, and that of course had its own perils. I'll include a link in the description to an interesting video about the Donner Party, but the Donner Wade Party, they were on their way to California when they got caught in the Sierra Nevadas and resorted to cannibalism to survive the winter. There's another problem with the South and slavery, and it's the runaway slave issue. Abolitionism is becoming more and more of an institution in the North, and it's seen as a virtuous thing to assist runaway slaves. And so an underground network called the Railroad opens up. Now, this isn't a subway system, okay? Do not get confused by this term of an underground railroad with engines and cars transporting runaway slaves. It's a network. Just like a railroad is a network of stations, this is a network of houses, a network of stations and bars and stuff like that, where runaway slaves would be guided to all these stations that would protect them from slave hunters. And they would either go to the north and stay or make their way to Canada, where there was no extradition of slaves to the United States. One of the most notable conductors was a runaway slave herself named Harriet Tubman, who we saw a picture of in a previous chapter. By 1850, Southerners demanded a new, stringent fugitive slave law. There were laws on the books, but they were inadequate as more and more states became unfriendly to slavery and would harbor runaway slaves. Authorities would fail to cooperate with it. And abolitionists who ran the Underground Railroad did not gain personally from their lawlessness. Slave owners were the losers. Estimated 1,000 runaways lost each year out of some 1 million slaves. And remember, we're not just talking about people here, because I want to, you want to root for the runaway slave here. But for the slave owners, they're losing investment. All right? Get away from the idea of just labor. They're losing investment here. Imagine owning a Ford F-150 King Ranch Edition $60,000, $70,000 truck, and one day you walk outside and it's gone and you can't get it back. That would hurt you financially because you're going to have to pay for it. Well, these slave owners, they were losing, $1,200 slaves, which in inflation comes out to $50,000 to $60,000 today, which is quite a bit of money that's just on feet walking away from the South. And so Southerners were ready for new laws. This is Harriet Tubman with some of the slaves she helped to free. Obviously, this is way, way, way after the Civil War. And here is old Harriet Tubman in her elder days. John Brown, who we haven't really talked about quite yet. We'll mention him a bit more when we get to Bleeding Kansas. Called her General Tubman for her effective work in helping slaves escape to Canada on the Underground Railroad. In 1850, the Southern fears were such that Congress was confronted with catastrophe. Again, California was banging on the door for statehood. They would have been brought in as a free state. The fire eaters in the South threatened secession if California was brought in as a free state without a slave state being brought in to balance it. There was a crisis among the assemblage of statesmen, and this is like the last hurrah of Congress in the 1800s. The old guard legislators, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams, they were all dying away. Literally dying away. John Quincy Adams, he died on the Capitol grounds. He had a stroke. And new, young gladiators were coming in who were ready for a fight. Clay, Calhoun, and Webster appeared together for the last time in 1850. Henry Clay, even though he ran for president so many times and lost each time, he'll be remembered for his compromises. And he was always able to get the North and the South, or the different sectional sides, together to make concessions to make a compromise. Calhoun always championed for the South, and he predicted if anti-slavery agitation was not ended, disunion would follow. And Daniel Webster urged all reasonable concessions to the South. Even though he was from the North, he wanted to keep a union in place by appeasing the South. The young guard from the North was more interested in the Union purified than patched and preserved. And so they were definitely, the new younger congressmen from the North were okay with the idea of the South splitting away if it would make the Union pure of slavery. Deadlock seemed certain, and President Taylor, being a slave-owning Southerner, was bent on vetoing any compromise that came out of the Congress. Here's an engraving of Henry Clay proposing the Compromise of 1850. All the senators listening in and watching him give his oratory. And one thing that really saves this whole thing is President Taylor dies in office. President Taylor helped the cause of concession by his sudden death, and therefore his veto was not hanging in the balance anymore. President Millard Fillmore, or Vice President Millard Fillmore, filled the presidential seat. Fillmore signed a series of compromise measures to save the Union. Southern opinion reluctantly accepted the verdict of Congress, and a quote-unquote second era of good feelings dawned after this. I told you that this was the last hurrah of the Senate. A couple of things here just to give you an idea of what I mean by that. Henry Clay was 73 years old when this compromise took place. And he's the one that proposed the series of compromises, of course. Senator John C. Calhoun was 68 and dying of tuberculosis. He was too weak to give his speech himself, but he sat bundled up in the Senate while a younger colleague read his words. And Calhoun actually died before the debate was even over, with his last words being, the South, God knows what will become of her." Daniel Webster was also 68 years old and ailing, but he gave his own speech to uphold Clay's compromise measures. The concessions to the North got to admit California as a free state. The territory that was disputed between Texas and New Mexico was surrendered to New Mexico. Texas gave up that land to pay for its debts. All of that land west of the Panhandle and all the way up into a little bit of Colorado and Wyoming. That land was given to the federal government whenever Texas became a state to pay off its debts, and then the Texas and New Mexico land was given up to New Mexico. And then slave trade in the District of Columbia was abolished, but not slavery itself. So you couldn't buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C., but you could still have slaves. The South gets the rest of the land that would become New Mexico and Utah without a restriction on slavery. So if enough people filled those territories who wanted slavery, they would get to make that choice. Texas receives $10 million from the federal government as compensation from that land sale. And the United States gets a more stringent fugitive slave law that is pretty harsh. Now the North gets the better end of the deal in the Compromise of 1850. California becomes a state, and so it is permanently, the Senate is permanently against the South from this point on. New Mexico and Utah are open to slavery, but there's no guarantee that enough people will go there to settle who will want slavery. It's open to popular sovereignty. If Northerners fill up New Mexico and Utah with population and they choose not to have slaves, they won't be slave states. And so Southerners urgently needed more slave territory, and they couldn't carve new states out of their conquest from Mexico, so they start looking even further south. Here is the state of slavery after the Compromise of 1850. You see here the slave states themselves, these tan states. Utah and New Mexico get opened up to slavery, but it's not guaranteed that they will be allowed to have slaves if enough people come in here and request free states. Here's the balance. There are 141 representatives in Congress for the North with 32 senators. There are 90 representatives from slave states with 30 senators. So it is unbalanced permanently at this point. So apparent gains of the South rang hollow. The area in dispute had been torn from slaveholding Texas, and New Mexico was almost certainly going to be a free soil area. The South halted the drive toward abolition in the District of Columbia, and the fugitive slave law of 1850 stirred up opposition in the North. Northerners who aided the escaped slaves were liable to heavy fines and jail sentences. So if you were one of those people working on the Underground Railroad and you were caught holding slaves as runaways, you yourself could be jailed and fined for aiding and abetting the escape property of Southerners. This quote-unquote man-stealing law had an explosive chain reaction in the North, with many people who were moderately in the middle of the abolition issue becoming staunchly anti-slavery at this point. And some states, like Massachusetts, even passed personal liberty laws, which hampered the enforcement of the slave laws, the fugitive slave laws. And this was an appalling blunder on the part of the South. This woke up the North, the spirit of antagonism against the South, and it further embittered Southerners. Northerners would not execute the law. Even some states even threatened to nullify the law, just like Southerners had threatened to nullify laws that they disagreed with back in the 1830s. Northerners were talking about nullifying this law that they didn't agree with. So, with all this tension happening, should a showdown have come in 1850? Well, from the standpoint of the secessionists, yes. This would have been the only time that the South would have stood a fighting chance of defeating the North or holding off the North in a civil war. At this point, a good majority of the wealth of the country was still distributed towards the South. With every passing decade, more factories were built, more foundries were built, more railroads were built in the North, and leaving the South behind. So the South would have stood a pretty good chance of holding its own in 1850 against the North. The delay in fighting actually led to a greater moral strength for the North. Abolitionism grew stronger. Anti-slavery grew stronger. And the South was seen as the enemy more and more and more. So the Compromise of 1850, from one point of view, was what won the Civil War for the Union. That 10-year, that 11-year gap between the Compromise of 1850 and the Civil War guaranteed victory for the North. 1852, you have another presidential election. Millard Fillmore does not run for president, I don't believe. I had to go back and look at that. Or he's not nominated anyway. The Democrats have a deadlock convention, and so they settle on candidate Franklin Pierce. He's another, quote, dark horse candidate. He was a New Hampshire lawyer / politician. He's called the fainting general by his opponents because of a groin wound he received in the Mexican War that caused him to fall off his horse. He was a pro-Southern Northerner, and he was acceptable to the slavery wing of the Democratic Party and emphatically endorsed the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, and all of that. The Whigs turned to General Winfield Scott. They tried to throw another general in the office after General Taylor dies. But the party was hopelessly split between anti-slavery Northerners, and then there were Southern Whigs who doubted Scott's loyalty to the Compromise of 1850. The Free Soil candidate was Senator John P. Hale, who siphoned off the Northern Whig votes, and Pierce won by a landslide. Franklin Pierce won 254 electoral votes to 42, but the popular vote was closer, 1.6 million to 1.3 million votes. And I'll have a link to the presidential elections and American history videos in the description. Here's a portrait of Franklin Pierce, our 14th president. This is an actual photograph, even though it looks like a drawing. It was done by Matthew Brady, a famous photographer in this time period. The election of 1852 was an end of the Whig Party as we know it. Its demise augured the eclipse of the national parties and the rise of sectional political alignments. The party choked to death. It tried to swallow the fugitive slave law, and it split apart because of it. The one great contribution was its idea to uphold the Union, which will be adopted later on by a new party. Now, we're going to have to talk about the legacy of the Mexican War, which we didn't talk about really in the last chapter. This is where it gets brought up again in 1850. The Mexican War victory really reinvigorated the idea of manifest destiny. That we were destined to maybe not just own the country from coast to coast, but maybe we were destined to control the country from north, or control the continent from north to south as well. We still had aspirations on Canada, although they were getting dimmer and dimmer. But Southern Americans, or Americans from the South, were looking more and more and more towards South America and Central America as being the next expansion point of America and slavery. Americans sought transportation routes from the narrow isthmus of Central America to California's gold fields, and so it became recognized that whoever controlled that route would hold sway over all future maritime nations. Now, we're not quite there to a Panama Canal yet, but the seed is being planted here. The idea of a waterway or a railroad connecting the two coasts. In 1850, there was a treaty between America and Great Britain that neither America nor Britain would seek exclusive control over any future Isthmian waterway, which will have to go and change in 1901 when we start working on the Panama Canal. But the slavocrats, the Southern Democrat slave owners, cast eyes southward. They see that Southern territory as new slave land, especially since the Compromise of 1850 closed, for all intents and purposes, New Mexico and Utah for slavery. So an American adventurer named William Walker actually goes down to Nicaragua and installs himself as president of Nicaragua in 1856 and promptly legalizes slavery. Rather bold move of him. He was backed by an armed force recruited largely from the South, and one Southern newspaper proclaimed to the planter aristocracy that Walker was a great-eyed man of destiny and now offers Nicaragua to you and your slaves. However, a coalition of Central American nations formed an alliance to overthrow him, and he was killed by a Honduran execution squad in 1860. So it didn't go so well for him. Cuba was also an enticing prospect for annexation. Rich sugar fields. They already had a tradition of slavery in Cuba. Cuba might be carved into several states, and it would restore political balance in the Senate if it was. President Polk, back during his time, considered even offering $100 million for Cuba to Spain. At after he was out of office in 1850 and 1851, there were 2 expeditions of several hundred armed men who went from the south onto Cuba. Both of the efforts were repelled, and 50 of the invaders were summarily shot or strangled by the Spaniards. In 1854, in retaliation, Spanish officials in Cuba seized an American steamship. President Pierce decided to provoke a war with Spain and seize Cuba, and he instructed his American ministers to meet in Onstead, Belgium, to draw up a plan to acquire Cuba. This was the book called some cloak and dagger episode stuff between Spain, Britain, and France and the American ambassador. Their top secret dispatch, known as the Ostend Manifesto, urged the administration to offer $120 million for Cuba. They determined that Spain's refusal would justify the United States in wresting the island, but when information about the manifesto leaked out, Northern Free Soilers rose up against it. The administration dropped its schemes, and the slavery issue was checked for the rest of the 1850s. Oregon and California made the United States a Pacific would-be power. In 1842, Britain gained free access to ports in China as well as control of Hong Kong. And so that left the United States also wanting to get into Asia as well. In 1844, President Tyler, I'm sorry, that's not right. Yes, that is right, I'm sorry. In 1844, President Tyler dispatches Caleb Cushing to the southern Chinese port of Macau, and also gets the Treaty of Wanagea signed, which secures the United States equal trading rights with other nations. Success in China inspires a more consequential mission. In 1852, President Fillmore dispatches to Japan a fleet of 4 warships commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry. Now, Japan had been closed for centuries. No Europeans had been allowed in Japan this whole time. But his fleet of 4 smoke-belching warships comes into Tokyo Bay with guns sticking out the side, and all of a sudden Japan decides that it might be a prudent idea to open up rights to the United States. And so in the Treaty of Kanagawa, I know I butchered that, Kanagawa, it opened up negotiations with the United States and Japan, allows for the proper treatment of shipwrecked sailors, and American coaling rights in Japan, so American steamships can refuel with coal in Japan, and the establishment of consular relations between the two. The Mexican-American War also brings up another problem between the states, or here in the United States, and that is the issue of transportation problems. California and Oregon were closer to Asia than they were to Washington, D.C. They were closer to Russia than Washington, D.C. It took too long to get by boat around the coast, around the southern coast of South America to get there, and it took too long by wagon, and it was dangerous. So finding a way to get across the country quickly was imperative, and building a transcontinental railroad was the only real solution to the problem. So where would it start? In the north or in the South. The South was eager to extend a railroad through the Southwestern Territory to California. The best railway route across the Southwest ran slightly south of the Mexican border. So in 1853, our minister to Mexico, James Gadsden, negotiated a treaty, and we bought for $10 million a little piece of land underneath present-day Arizona for a southern railroad. Northerners backed a route that would go through Nebraska, and so they were trying to get Nebraska organized as a territory and get a railroad built through there. Here's the southern route right here. It would start in Houston, go to El Paso. This bluish tealish area is the area that was bought by Gadsden from Mexico, and it would end in Los Angeles. Most of this route today is still passable. It's called the Southwest Unlimited, and you can ride that route on Amtrak today. It's not built in 1853. This route doesn't get built until 1882, after the transcontinental route is finished in 1869. So now we get to, Now we get to Kansas and Nebraska. This is going to be one of the last things we talk about today in this chapter. So Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, he was an ardent booster for the West, and he longed to break the deadlock over the westward expansion and stretch a line of settlements across the continent. He was heavily invested in Chicago real estate and in railway stock, and he was eager to have the Windy City, Chicago, be the eastern terminus where the proposed Pacific Railroad would begin. For that to happen, something has to be done with Nebraska. So the proposed territory of Nebraska was carved into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and he needed to have Southerners be supportive of this, otherwise it wouldn't pass through Congress. So slavery, he proposes, would be settled by popular sovereignty. And Kansas could presumably choose whether it wanted to be a slave state or a free state, and Nebraska would presumably become a free state. And Douglas's proposal, his legislative scheme, flatly contradicts the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So Southerners rise to the bait. Douglas's bill was a chance to gain more slave states for the South, and President Pierce threw his weight behind the Kansas-Nebraska bill as well. Now, for Northerners, the Missouri Compromise was almost as sacred as the Constitution itself. But Douglas rammed the bill through Congress with strong support of many Southerners. Here's the map that's on page 292 in your book. Here's the territory that we're talking about. Before Douglas, all this was still relatively unorganized territory. It was open for settlement, but people weren't really flocking there. All this was determined by the Missouri Compromise, this line right here, that nothing above this line, 3630, would be slave territory. But this new law, this proposal, the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854, opens up this area right here to slavery by popular sovereignty. So now we have basically a third of the country open up to popular sovereignty, that if the South was powerful enough, they could send people and slaves here and make these become slave territories. The North is not happy with this. This is one of the most momentous measures to pass Congress, and it angered the anti-slavery Northerners by what they condemned as an act of bad faith. It made all future compromise with the South immeasurably more difficult. It made the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 a dead letter, and it wrecked two compromises altogether, 1820 and 1850. It was a hellstorm waiting to happen. Northern abolitionists and Southern fire eaters saw intolerable circumstances, and from this, a new Republican Party sprang up in the Midwest. The new Republican Party was a moral protest against the gains of slavery, and it consisted of the dissatisfied elements and foes of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This became a second major political party almost overnight, and it brought about the dreaded sectional rift between the country. This is the position that we're in leading into disunion, where we see bloodshed break out and fighting in Kansas and Nebraska over the issue of slavery. And that is where we leave it for the day. So I hope that you enjoyed this lecture and my explanation of the chapter. Remember, you need to be reading this material as well, or getting it from a friend if you don't have your book. You also need to be doing the assignments online, because that will make you read the chapter and reinforce the questions that you're going to have on your next test. We're doing 2 chapters this week. We'll be doing chapter 19 on Thursday, and I'll be posting that. Check the bottom for links in the description, and I'm going to put timestamps of the different sections of this chapter. Remember, your next test is going to be due on April 25th, and your historical book review is going to be due that day as well. I hope you're all doing well, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Goodbye.